There are moments in life when a person becomes so unpredictable that others begin watching them closely, trying to decode a pattern that no longer exists. The monitoring rarely comes from admiration. It comes from confusion. They once understood the older version easily. That version reacted on cue, opened up too quickly, explained too much, trusted too easily. But the newer version moves through life with a quiet rhythm that doesn't match the expectations anyone had for them. Their world is built from healing, from self-awareness, from truth that was earned through scars. Observers get unsettled because nothing about this rebuilt identity follows the emotional script they memorized. The monitored person carries an inner world that outsiders cannot step into. What they see is movement without explanation, choices without fear, boundaries without apology. And confusion always turns into curiosity for those who depended on clarity to feel in control. The most interesting part is that the observers rarely realize what they are doing. They watch out of habit, out of suspicion, out of something unspoken they do not want to admit. They lean in because the person they once misread has become someone they cannot predict. They monitor old conversations, new actions, subtle shifts in tone. They take mental notes trying to understand how someone who once carried so much emotional weight suddenly became light enough to navigate their days without seeking permission. The inner world that grew from pain looks like mystery to those who caused it, and mystery bothers people who used to feel superior. It forces them to confront how little they ever understood. In toxic relationships, this same monitoring shows up in strange ways. The one who once held emotional advantage suddenly feels disconnected from the storyline. They reach out to check in, pretending concern, pretending interest, but truth is simpler. They want to know whether they still influence anything at all. They scroll through social media, not because they care deeply, but because silence from the other side shakes them. The monitored person's world has expanded, while theirs has stayed the same. That imbalance makes them restless. They cannot understand how someone they once destabilized now walks with such steadiness. So they observe from a distance, hoping to find a weakness that will bring the old dynamic back. But the world they're watching no longer contains that version. The monitored person senses the eyes sometimes, not clearly, not directly, but in subtle ways. The change in someone's tone, the way a message feels different, the shift in how people show up unexpectedly. It's not paranoia, it's instinct learned from surviving manipulation. Trauma teaches the mind to read shadows long before shadows become obvious. Yet instead of becoming fearful, the monitored person learns to stay grounded. They realize that being watched doesn't mean being controlled. It simply means others are confused by the transformation they refused to understand when it mattered. The inner world has boundaries now. Doors that close automatically. Locks that cannot be picked. Awareness replaced vulnerability. Observers often believe they're studying someone who lost their path. But what unsettles them is the opposite. The person finally found one. They no longer chase validation. No longer explain their emotions. No longer soften themselves to be understood. This shift threatens people who relied on emotional access to maintain an upper hand. When someone becomes self-directed, outsiders feel excluded. They cannot interpret the decisions anymore. They cannot predict the responses. Their monitoring becomes frantic because clarity has vanished. Watching becomes their only way to feel involved in a life they can no longer enter. The monitored one walks forward with purpose shaped quietly, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that demands applause, simply in a way that aligns. Alignment looks like mystery to those who live misaligned. People who operate from insecurity assume complexity where there is only clarity. They misinterpret silence as strategy. They misinterpret boundaries as revenge. They misinterpret calm as indifference. In truth, the monitored person is simply living with intention now, something the watchers never learned to develop in themselves. That gap becomes a wound they try to cover with curiosity. There's an irony to this shift. The observers assume they are studying someone fragile, someone unstable, someone unpredictable. Yet they slowly begin to notice that their own behavior becomes obsessive. They're the ones overthinking. They're the ones trying to decode movements. They're the ones replaying old conversations, searching for hidden meaning. Meanwhile, the monitored person is simply living, growing, healing. The contrast becomes a quiet humiliation the watchers do not speak about. It exposes a truth they try to ignore. The one they underestimated moved forward, and they stayed behind. The world the monitored person built now comes from an internal compass, not external pressure. This new direction creates a space outsiders cannot enter, because they never helped build it. People who caused harm often assume they can reappear whenever they choose. They assume old access remains available. But when trust breaks deeply, the heart builds new architecture. Stronger walls, cleaner foundations, softer lighting, fewer doors. Only those who earned a place inside can understand the glow. Outsiders remain confused because they only see the exterior, impenetrable, unreadable, unfamiliar. The observers realize something they never expected. Their monitoring is not protecting them from anything. It's revealing everything they refused to see. How much they relied on the emotional chaos they once created, how much they depended on the confusion they once caused. Now, without that access, their world feels smaller. The one they monitored feels expansive. That reversal breaks them quietly. They finally see that their understanding was shallow, while the person they watched had depths they never bothered to explore. Depth scares the shallow. Depth has a way of unsettling people who spent their entire lives skating across the surface of everything. Shallow souls move through the world chasing distraction, chasing validation, chasing noise. They avoid stillness because stillness forces reflection, and reflection forces accountability. When someone shows up with real emotional depth, it exposes every corner of the shallow person's inner space. It highlights how little they know themselves. It reveals how much of their personality is performance, and that revelation is frightening. Depth does not attack. Depth does not intimidate. Depth simply exists in a way that demands honesty. Anyone who spent years hiding from their own truth feels exposed around it. This is why certain people became so uncomfortable around the one who evolved. Not because the evolved one was threatening, but because their inner world acted like a mirror, showing others the parts they had been refusing to face. In toxic relationships, depth often becomes the quiet reason tension grows. One person enters with sincerity, wanting connection built on awareness, communication, and understanding. The other arrives with habits shaped by avoidance, denial, and emotional shortcuts. At first, the shallow person finds the depth attractive, mysterious, comforting, almost healing. But that admiration quickly dissolves when they realize depth does not let them hide. The deeper person notices shifts in energy, hears meaning beneath words, senses emotional inconsistencies. What the shallow person tries to mask becomes visible instantly. That visibility terrifies them. Instead of growing, they retreat. Instead of listening, they mock. Instead of learning, they sabotage. Depth requires effort, and effort threatens someone who only knows shortcuts. The shallow person begins feeling powerless in the presence of someone who sees too much. They misunderstand this awareness as superiority, when in reality it's simply the byproduct of someone who has lived through pain honestly, someone who did not run from heartbreak, someone who allowed life to shape them instead of numbing themselves to avoid responsibility. That kind of emotional maturity exposes emotional immaturity without a single word being spoken. The shallow person feels inferior without understanding why. They react with defensiveness, with sarcasm, with detachment. They try to flip the script, pretend they are the ones in control. But depth cannot be controlled. It cannot be intimidated. It cannot be manipulated. It stands alone with a kind of quiet power that shallow people secretly envy, but publicly fear. There comes a moment where the shallow one realizes the dynamic is no longer in their favor. The behaviors that worked on others, gaslighting, silent treatments, hot and cold affection, fall flat. Depth renders those tactics useless. The deeper person recognizes patterns instantly. They refuse to participate in confusion. They refuse to collapse into insecurity. This refusal unsettles the shallow partner because it forces them to confront the emptiness of their own emotional toolbox. They only know how to cope through distraction and control. Depth dismantles both effortlessly, and the shallow person begins to resent the one who unintentionally exposes this imbalance. Conflicts become strange. The shallow person tries to argue from ego. The deep person responds from understanding. The shallow one seeks victory. The deep one seeks clarity. The shallow one runs. The deep one reflects. These opposing emotional languages collide repeatedly until the shallow partner becomes overwhelmed. They begin claiming the deeper person is too much, too sensitive, too intense, when the truth is simpler. They feel small in comparison. They feel exposed. They feel seen, and being seen without control terrifies them. Shallow souls survive by avoiding depth, not confronting it. Depth becomes threatening not because it is harsh, but because it is honest. It brings truth into conversations where lies once thrived. It brings awareness into spaces built on denial. It brings stability into relationships built on emotional turbulence. The shallow person panics when confronted with someone who does not fear emotions, because emotion is the one thing they never learn to manage. Depth does not withdraw during difficult discussions. It does not collapse when tension rises. It does not use silence as a shield. It stays present. And presence is a battlefield shallow people have no armor for. Eventually, the shallow partner realizes the deeper one cannot be controlled. They cannot be manipulated into insecurity. They cannot be pushed into emotional collapse. They cannot be conditioned to stay small. This realization leads to the one emotion shallow people try hardest to avoid: shame. Shame forces self-awareness. Shame demands accountability. Shame highlights immaturity. That inner exposure shakes them, often leading them to lash out rather than evolve. But no amount of hostility can change the fact that depth destabilizes shallow behavior the way truth destabilizes lies. When the separation finally occurs, the shallow person is left confused. They try convincing themselves the deeper soul was dramatic, difficult, complicated. But every quiet moment afterward brings them back to the same truth. They weren't afraid of the person. They were afraid of themselves in the presence of that person. They feared the expectations. They feared the emotional transparency. They feared growing up emotionally. Depth requires growth. Growth requires discomfort. And shallow people run from discomfort as if it were danger itself. Meanwhile, the deeper person continues forward, not from superiority but from necessity. Their world thrives on understanding. Their spirit thrives on sincerity. Their peace thrives on emotional honesty. They do not look back with bitterness. They look back with clarity. They understand now that two people can share time without sharing capacity. They understand that depth cannot thrive in shallow waters without drowning. They understand that leaving was not abandonment. It was survival. And the truth revealed itself fully once the distance settled. The shallow ones kept watching from afar, unable to comprehend the person they lost. Not because the deeper soul was complicated, but because their own emotional world had no room for the weight of reality. Depth scares the shallow because it demands evolution. And those who fear evolution always lose the ones who outgrow the surface. There is a moment after every separation where the shallow one sits alone and finally feels the silence they once used as a weapon. In that silence, depth echoes louder than words ever could. They remember conversations they dismissed. They recall emotions they laughed at. They replay moments where the deeper soul tried to communicate truth, and they treated it like a performance. Now those same words hover around them like ghosts. The shallow heart begins to realize that the depth they pushed away was the only thing that ever offered real connection. But by the time understanding arrives, the deeper heart has already moved into a different season. A season where peace replaces chaos. A season where boundaries feel natural instead of forced. That realization becomes a quiet punishment the shallow person carries long after the relationship ends. The deeper soul's world expands in ways the shallow one never imagined. They begin forming connections based on honesty, not performance. Conversations feel smoother. Trust feels cleaner. Emotions feel safer.